I'm Claire, and I was 38 when my husband divorced me via text. He informed me he was departing for Miami with his 20-year-old babe and had already cleaned out our shared bank account. Ha ha ha, he added, my composed response. Good luck. He didn't realize what I had already set in motion until it was far too late. The text arrived as I was assisting customers in my boutique. I'm leaving you and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account. My hands remained steady as I read. My voice was unwavering as I helped Mrs. Peterson select a scarf. The only indication that my years-long marriage had just been obliterated by a text message was a subtle tightening around my eyes. I waited until Mrs. Peterson departed, her purchase encased in our distinctive silver paper, before I typed my reply. Good luck. While Mark probably reveled in his dramatic exit, picturing me devastated by his betrayal, I was calmly securing my boutique for the evening. The warning signs had been accumulating for months. Late nights at the office that didn't correspond with his paycheck deposits, the newly implemented password on his phone, his sudden dedication to the gym, and a wardrobe refresh aimed at recapturing his youth. 3 months prior, I had discovered a receipt for a dinner for two at a pricey restaurant on a night he'd claimed to be working late. That same evening, I established a separate bank account at a different institution. A week later, when he suggested consolidating our accounts for simplicity, I'd readily agreed, all while transferring my personal savings to the new account. The joint account, the one he'd just drained, contained precisely enough to prevent him from becoming suspicious, approximately 2 months' worth of typical deposits. The remainder was safely stashed away, along with meticulous records of every questionable transaction he'd made in the past year. My phone vibrated again. Don't bother begging. Melissa and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later. Melissa, the new receptionist at his workplace. I'd encountered her at the company Christmas gathering, observed her excessive laughter at Mark's jokes, and noticed how she touched his arm when she assumed no one was watching. She was young enough to be his daughter, naive enough to believe she was unique. I refrained from responding to his text. Instead, I contacted my lawyer, the one I'd consulted 2 months earlier upon discovering the hotel charges on our credit card statement. It's time, I stated plainly. He just made his move. The papers are ready, she confirmed. I'll file them first thing tomorrow. Do you want me to have him served in Miami? No rush, I replied. Let him think he's won first. Another message from Mark. I know this must be hard for you. You're not getting any younger after all. At least you have your little shop to keep you busy. My little shop, the prosperous boutique I'd established from the ground up, the one that generated more revenue than his middle management position, the one whose profits I'd meticulously kept separate from our shared finances. I smiled, envisioning the certified letters that would await him in Miami. Let him savor his moment of triumph. I spent that night in our house, my house, as I'd inherited it from my grandmother and retained it in my name, despite Mark's frequent suggestions to add him to the deed. Another fortunate instinct that had proven beneficial. While compiling the documents my lawyer would require, I came across our wedding album. Mark appeared so different then, before his midlife crisis had transformed him into a parody of his former self. Nowadays, he wore shirts that were too tight for his softening midsection, strained to connect with the 20-somethings at his office, and used slang that sounded absurd coming from a 45-year-old man. My phone continued to buzz with messages from him, each more patronizing than the last. I've been planning this for months. Melissa understands me in ways you never could. You'll be fine. Maybe you'll find someone more your own age. Already told my family, they agree. We grew apart. It's nobody's fault, really. I captured screenshots of each message, adding them to my evidence folder. Let him dig his own grave deeper. My lawyer would appreciate his nonchalant admission of premeditation, his jubilant announcement about emptying our account. The final text caught my attention. BTW, I used the joint card to book our flights and hotel. Consider it my parting gift, LOL. Perfect, I thought. I contacted the credit card company. Mrs. Harrison speaking, I need to report fraudulent charges and cancel a card immediately. Of course, ma'am. Can you identify the charges? 2 first-class tickets to Miami, booked today. Hotel charges at the Royal Palm, and I'll need to remove my husband as an authorized user. Do you have documentation of the fraud? Text messages from my husband admitting he used our joint card to book travel with his girlfriend after emptying our bank account. I'll be happy to forward them. The representative's professional demeanor couldn't entirely conceal her satisfaction as she reversed the charges. Mark and Melissa would arrive at the airport the following day to discover their tickets invalidated, their hotel reservation cancelled. My phone buzzed again. Don't worry about the house. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller. I actually laughed aloud at that one. Did he genuinely believe he had any claim to my grandmother's house? Had his ego expanded to such an extent that he'd forgotten whose name was on the deed? Another buzz. And I know the shop means a lot to you. We can work out a fair payment for your half. My half of my business, that I'd built myself, funded myself, grown myself, while he complained about my extended hours and referred to it as my hobby. I poured a glass of wine, the premium vintage I'd been reserving for a special occasion. This qualified. Tomorrow, Mark would learn some difficult lessons about property law and separate assets. But tonight, I would relish the tranquility and strategize my next chapter. The following morning brought a series of increasingly irate texts from Mark. What the heck did you do to our credit card? The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel cancelled our reservation. Answer me. I silenced my phone and proceeded to my boutique. Friday was always our busiest day, and I had a new shipment of designer handbags to unpack. Life continues, even when your husband absconds with a receptionist young enough to be his daughter. Around noon, his mother called. Claire, dear, Mark told us everything about how controlling you've been, how you drove him away. He says you're being vindictive now, causing problems with his travel plans. I placed her on speakerphone while I arranged a window display. Did he mention emptying our joint account and charging tickets for him and his girlfriend on our credit card? Silence. Then, well, he said you left him no choice, that you'd been cold and distant. Barbara, I have his texts. Would you like me to read them to you? The one where he bragged about taking our money? Or maybe the one where he mocked my age? Another pause. He did seem a bit cruel. I told him the text message was inappropriate. I appreciate the call, Barbara. I've always liked you, but I think it's best if we end this conversation now. My lawyer has advised minimal contact with Mark's family during the proceedings. Proceedings already? Goodbye, Barbara. By late afternoon, Mark's sister Amanda was disseminating family gossip through mutual friends. Apparently, Mark and Melissa were stranded at a budget motel near the airport, their Miami dreams temporarily derailed. He'd attempted to use his personal credit cards, but those had been maxed out for months, another red flag I'd previously noted. My lawyer called with an update. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday. Given his admission of emptying the joint account and the documented credit card fraud, we're in a strong position to freeze all remaining assets. Has he been served yet? Not yet, but he'll get the papers at his new motel address. Speaking of which, his girlfriend's social media is providing excellent evidence. She's been posting about their adventure all day, including some choice comments about you. I smiled, contemplating my own documentation. A year's worth of suspicious charges, hotel receipts, text messages that demonstrated premeditation. Mark had been so fixated on his grand escape that he'd never considered I might be observing, waiting, preparing. My phone vibrated with another text. You think you're so smart, but I made copies of all the boutique's financial records. Half that business is mine. I forwarded the text to my lawyer, adding it to the burgeoning file of Mark's blunders. Let him learn the hard way about separate assets and business ownership. Sometimes, The most effective revenge is simply being prepared. The emergency hearing on Monday was everything I could have desired. Mark appeared in his new young wardrobe. Designer jeans that were too tight for his age, a blazer that screamed midlife crisis. Melissa waited outside, her youth painfully evident under the harsh courthouse lighting. My lawyer presented our evidence methodically. Mark's gleeful text about emptying our account, his credit card fraud, his documented history of concealed expenses, each piece meticulously gathered over months of silent observation. Your Honor, Mark's hastily retained lawyer attempted, my client admits to some rash decisions, but Mrs. Harrison's actions have been vindictive and calculating. Calculating? My lawyer countered. You mean prudent? My client protected her separate assets and maintained detailed records of her husband's suspicious behavior. That's not vindictive. That's smart business. The judge reviewed my documentation. The separate property deed to the house, the boutique's incorporation papers in my name only, the meticulous separation of business and personal finances that Mark had always criticized. Mr. Harrison, the judge addressed Mark directly, you admitted via text message to deliberately emptying a joint account and using shared credit cards to fund a trip with your girlfriend. Do you deny this? Mark shifted uneasily. I was just trying to make a clean break. By committing financial fraud? The judge raised an eyebrow. And now you're claiming rights to property that documentation clearly shows is separate from marital assets? The business grew during our marriage, Mark's lawyer interjected. My client is entitled to. The business was established before the marriage, my lawyer interrupted, and Mrs. Harrison maintained strict separation of business and personal finances throughout. We have documentation of every penny invested and earned. I observed Mark's face as reality began to dawn on him. He'd assumed this would be effortless. Empty our accounts, flee with his girlfriend, perhaps claim half my business in the divorce. He'd never bothered to comprehend my insistence on keeping things separate, had mocked my meticulous bookkeeping as obsessive. The court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct, the judge announced. All shared assets are frozen pending final dissolution. Mr. Harrison is ordered to return any funds removed from joint accounts within 24 hours. But that money is gone, Mark protested. We spent it on. Then I suggest you find a way to replace it. The judge cut him off. And Mr. Harrison, the court takes a very dim view of using shared credit cards to fund adventures with paramours. Outside the courthouse, I overheard Melissa inquiring about their Miami plans. His response was lost in the sound of my heels clicking confidently across the marble floor, heading back to the business he'd never understood or respected. The subsequent weeks brought a string of increasingly desperate maneuvers from Mark. He attempted to claim the boutique had been his idea. He remembered investing money in its early days. He even suggested he'd been my business partner all along. Claims swiftly refuted by my meticulous records. He's getting desperate, my lawyer observed. His girlfriend's social media indicates they are residing in her studio apartment now. Apparently, living on a receptionist's salary isn't quite the glamorous escape he envisioned. Mark's family began reaching out, their tone markedly different from their initial accusations. We had no idea, his sister Amanda admitted. He told us you'd been cold, controlling, that he needed to escape. But then we saw his texts, the way he bragged about taking your money. That's not the brother I thought I knew. His mother called again, this time in tears. The things he said about your age, about replacing you with someone younger. I raised him better than that. I thought I did anyway. I allowed their calls to go to voicemail. Their support might have held significance weeks earlier, but now it felt like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The boutique thrived, ironically boosted by local gossip about my situation. Women began arriving specifically to show support, often departing with far more than they'd initially intended to purchase. My ex tried something similar, one customer confided while buying a designer handbag. Thought he'd take everything in the divorce. Men like that never expect us to be smarter than them. My phone still vibrated occasionally with texts from Mark, his tone fluctuating between anger and manipulation. You've ruined everything. I never meant to hurt you. You'll regret being so vindictive. Can't we work something out? That business would be nothing without my support. I forwarded each message to my lawyer without responding. Let him dig his own grave deeper. Through the grapevine, I learned Melissa was having second thoughts. Apparently, sharing her studio apartment with a middle-aged man who couldn't afford his own residence wasn't the romantic adventure she'd imagined. The age gap, which had seemed exhilarating during clandestine hotel meetings, felt different in the harsh light of reality. She posted about toxic relationships and learning from mistakes yesterday, my lawyer mentioned during an update call, and removed her relationship status this morning. I almost felt sorry for Mark. Almost. But then I remembered his haha after informing me he'd emptied our account. The casual cruelty of his comments about my age, the way he'd assumed I'd be helpless without him. Instead of pity, I felt something else. Pride. Pride in my foresight, in my quiet strength, in my ability to protect myself while he underestimated me. The final divorce hearing painted a vastly different picture from Mark's envisioned triumph. Gone was his cocky demeanor, replaced by barely concealed panic. Melissa was noticeably absent. She'd moved on to a co-worker her own age, according to office gossip. Mark had appeared in his old attire, the designer wardrobe apparently returned to help repay the joint account he'd emptied. His lawyer appeared exhausted, likely from attempting to locate loopholes in my documented separation of assets. Your Honor, Mark's lawyer attempted one final time. Despite the separate property documentation, my client contributed to the growth of his wife's business through moral support and… Moral support? My lawyer interrupted. Like these text messages belittling Mrs. Harrison's business as a little shop? Or these social media posts referring to it as her hobby? The judge had clearly seen enough. The final settlement reflected my meticulous planning. I retained my house, my business, and my separate assets. Mark received his personal possessions and his car, which was worth less than he owed on it. You've destroyed me, he hissed as we exited the courthouse. I'll have to move back in with my parents. No, Mark, you destroyed yourself. I just ensured you couldn't destroy me too. His mother was waiting outside, prepared to drive him to her residence, his new home at 45. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd mocked my age was now residing in his childhood bedroom, while I continued operating my successful business. You planned this all along, he accused. You knew this would happen. No, I replied. I just paid attention. And unlike you, I understood the value of keeping good records. His mother stepped between us. That's enough, Mark. You've embarrassed yourself enough already. As they walked away, I overheard her begin to scold him. Honestly, what were you thinking? A 20-year-old, emptying bank accounts, sending those horrible texts? I watched them disappear into the parking lot, feeling nothing but relief. Mark had believed he was composing the conclusion to our story with that cruel text. Instead, he'd merely set my carefully laid plans into motion. My phone vibrated, not with texts from Mark this time, but with notifications of new orders from my boutique's website. Life was progressing, just not in the direction he'd imagined. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my boutique had expanded to a second location. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Mark struggled to rebuild his life, the little shop he'd dismissed was thriving. I had hired 3 new employees and launched an online store. Word of Mark's circumstances trickled back through mutual acquaintances. He'd tried dating apps, but found women his age weren't interested. Younger women, having heard about his history, steered clear. His career had suffered too, following an HR investigation into his relationship with a subordinate. Amanda visited the boutique. I know we didn't support you at first, she admitted, but I am ashamed. My lawyer kept me updated on Mark's continued attempts to challenge the settlement. Each petition was denied. He even claimed his text about the account was a joke. The boutique's success brought unexpected validation. Business magazines wanted to feature my story. Young entrepreneurs sought advice. Mark's mother called occasionally after Mark's latest self-destructive act. My life was full, with plans for expansion. The only reminder of Mark was a framed screenshot of his last text. Have fun with your little shop in your old age. Below it sat my latest business award. 1 year after the divorce, I opened my third boutique. Melissa unexpectedly walked in. I owe you an apology, she said. She'd believed Mark's lies, but then saw his manipulation tactics firsthand. Those weren't his dreams, Melissa, I said. They were escapes. She knew that now, she said, and was dating someone her own age, building something real. My assistant manager whispered, Was that the girlfriend? No, I replied. That was just another woman who learned the same lesson I did. Mark's mother called one last time, not to discuss Mark, but to thank me. You taught our family an important lesson, she said, about enabling. I reviewed plans for a fourth location. Mark had intended to diminish me. Instead, he'd pushed me to be stronger. My phone buzzed, another petition from Mark, dismissed. I smiled. 2 years after the text, I was invited to speak at a conference. My story had evolved from cautionary tale to inspiration. The boutique chain had grown to 5 locations. Mark had moved out, finally, to an apartment above a garage. He'd taken a lower-paying job. Melissa, ironically, had become a regular customer. You inspired me, she said, to build something lasting. I kept Mark's text framed, proof of how far I'd come. Below it, a sign. Success is the best revenge. At the 5-year anniversary of my original boutique, I addressed my employees. Mark's mother attended, uninvited. She waited to approach me. I saw Mark yesterday, she said, smoothing her designer dress, purchased from my store.